Good evening and welcome to the first Melbourne Jewish Book Week event for 2022. I'm Nicholas Brash, Director of Melbourne Jewish Book Week, and I'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which Melbourne Jewish Book Week is based, and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of lands across Australia, their elders, ancestors, cultures, and heritage. Tonight is our regular collaboration with Jewish Quarterly, and we have Eva Hoffman in conversation with Alex Skovron about Eva's essay on the remarkable but almost forgotten Polish Jewish poet Zuzanna Ginczanka. Eva Hoffman grew up in Krakow, Poland, before emigrating in her teens to Canada and then the United States. After receiving her PhD in literature from Harvard University, she worked as senior editor and literary critic at the New York Times and has taught at various British and American universities. Her books, which have been translated widely, include Lost in Translation, After Such Knowledge, The Secret, and Illuminations. She has written and presented programs for BBC Radio and lectured internationally on subjects of exile, historical memory, human rights, and other contemporary issues. She has received numerous awards and fellowships and is currently a visiting professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies at University College London. Alex Skovron was born in Poland, lived briefly in Israel, and emigrated to Australia aged 9. He's the author of 7 collections of poetry, a prose novella, and a book of short stories. His new collection, Letters from the Periphery, will be launched in March. His earlier volume of new and selected poems, Towards the Equator, was shortlisted in the Prime Minister's Literary Awards. Alex's work has been translated into a number of languages. Bilingual editions of his poetry in French and Chinese have been published, as well as Czech translations of his novella, The Poet, and his volume of stories, The Man Who Took to His Bed. His numerous public readings have included appearances in China, Serbia, India, Ireland, Macedonia, and Portugal. And just a quick heads up, Alex will be discussing Letters from the Periphery in our Book Chats video series soon, so keep an eye out for that. Please join me at the end of this conversation for some news about upcoming events and very excitedly in-person events at last, including our festival. In the meantime, without any further ado, over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. And Eva, good morning and good evening.
Indeed. Good evening and good morning. Yes.
Well, good to see you again. Well, let me start by saying, as Nick has mentioned, you're best known for books that include Lost in Translation, Shtetl, After Such Knowledge, and you've written about migration, cross-cultural identity, history, Holocaust, traumatic memory. You've also published 2 novels. Now you've taken up the story of Zuzanna Ginczanka, a young Polish Jewish poet who was murdered by the Nazis. Your essay presents an absorbing account of the life, character, and poetic prowess of Zuzanna Ginczanka. I'm interested in the special resonance you feel for this unusual young woman who died the year you were born. Your essay is titled The Unforgetting of Zuzanna Ginczanka. Could you say something about what first sparked your interest in this poet and maybe how it links up with some of your earlier concerns?
Well, I first became aware of Ginczanka. I think I vaguely knew her name, but, really vaguely. And I became aware of her in a conversation with Philippe Sands, who is an internationally renowned author of books like East-West Street and The Rat Line. But he's also a human rights lawyer. And we were having a conversation about various matters. And he said, have I heard about a poet named Ginczanka, whatever, I had to pronounce it for him. But he was working with a group of Polish filmmakers in Paris who were making, I hope still are making, a film about Ginczanka. I say I hope they're still making it because there have now been difficulties because of the nature of the support group, which is now very conservative. Anyway, Philippe Sands was called in to briefly collaborate on this because Ginczanka wrote a poem towards the end of her life, and I'm sure we'll come back to it, which became the subject and which was used in the only legal case ever in which a poem was used as evidence. And so Philippe was called to sort of, consider this and comment on this. So, this was all very fascinating. So when then, by complete coincidence, the Jewish Quarterly asked me, I think about 2 weeks later, would I want to do an essay on somebody named Ginczanka? I was very ready to do it. And, by that time I'd looked at some materials about her. So this is what happened.
Was there a lot of material available about her?
Well, she was born in 1917. So 2017 was the 100th anniversary of her birth. So there was a big exhibition about her at the Mickiewicz Institute, the Polish Literary Institute. There was an exhibition, and there were several people writing about her, and all of these materials, were then made available to me. So, and then I acquired a biography of her in Polish and a collection of her poems in Polish.
And you found yourself increasingly absorbed by this extraordinary woman, I think. Can you paint us a brief word picture? Because, your essay is fascinating, and it tells us so much about the many sides, many facets of her nature, her personality. She was a literary prodigy, an exotic beauty, a brilliant and admired poet, and perhaps a proto-feminist who adopted the nickname Ginczanka, which actually wasn't her real name, was Gincburg.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about some of these sides of her nature, and also especially about her family life, her early family life, and why she adopted that pseudonym?
Yes. Well, the many sides of her nature, emerge very much in her poetry, and perhaps we can talk about them as we go on and as we talk about, her life. But her early life, was affected by the political dramas of the period, as so much in Polish history is. So she was probably born in Kiev, where her parents had lived before 1917. But then when Kiev became absorbed into Russia, they came back to the town of Równe, where Ginczanka was born and where she grew up. So they came back to Równe and bringing baby Zuzanna with her in 1917. 1917, I know it's contentious as to whether 1917 or 1918 was the year when Poland regained independence. In fact, it was announced by Woodrow Wilson in 1917, and then 1917 to 18 was kind of a complicated year. Anyway, they came back to the Ukraine, to the, which was then in Poland. And to the home of her mother's parents, of Ginczanka's grandparents, and they brought baby Zuzanna with her. So Zuzanna then grew up in Równe. I should say that, subsequently, both her parents abandoned her. very strangely and for very strange reasons. Her father was a bit of a kind of, not quite a con man, but a little bit of a con man. He thought of himself as a very talented actor, and lied about his career and later in his later years. In fact, he somehow ended up in New York and did perfectly ordinary jobs. And her mother remarried. And she got married to a much younger man, and she was apparently worried that this much younger man would become interested in her daughter, in Zuzanna, who was very beautiful to begin with, later on, and so she wanted to get away as well, and they ended up very oddly in Pamplona. It was not a kind of usual destination for emigrating Jews then. So then Zuzanna was, left with her grandparents. Her grandfather was ill and died rather soon. And so she was really brought up by her grandmother, who was a very impressive woman. Shall I go on a little bit about her grandmother?
Please, yes.
Yeah, so her grandmother Chaya. So they lived in quite a sort of well-appointed, prosperous house, and Chaya ran a pharmacy downstairs, a pharmacy which was also a kind of a variety shop, in which you could buy anything, you could buy toys, you could buy cinema tickets, you could buy, some jewelry. I mean, you could buy all manner of things. And so, but it was also a pharmacy. She was a pharmacist. And she was a very powerful presence and a very wonderful presence, and a very strong influence on little Zuzanna. I mean, she basically played the role of Zuzanna's mother. Mm-hmm. So yes, so this, these were the early years.
And did Zuzanna ever see her father again after he left the family?
Never. Nor her mother, no. I mean, there was some strange communication from her mother via somebody later on, much later on, but no, they were not heard from. I suppose the other, interesting part about those very early years is that Poland was a very multicultural place, and Chaya was she was utterly Jewish identified, but she was completely secular. She was not religious at all. And during Christmas, she placed Zuzanna in the window of the pharmacy dressed as an angel. I think, partly to say everybody is welcome here, Jewish and non-Jewish, and Jewish and Christian. And so Zuzanna was a little angel, and she really looked absolutely angelic.
And she probably enjoyed being looked at as well, being on display.
It's quite possible, yes. I mean, she was a child then, but yes, I don't think she would have minded very much.
No. And she started writing poetry very early, didn't she?
Incredibly early. I mean, sort of at the age of 4, she was writing poetry, which was recognizable as poetry, or, poetry, sort of poetic prose. She really was a poetic prodigy. And, poetic prodigies are rather rare, it seems to me. I mean, there are quite a few musical prodigies. We know about, people like Lang Lang, the Chinese pianist. I mean, there have been musical prodigies, but performing prodigies. But, that's performance. I mean, in other words, they're not creating something.
Yes.
But Zuzanna was a poetic prodigy. She started writing, little poems and sort of, prose poems, really when she was 4 years old. I mean, the only other prodigy I can think of like that was somebody named Minou Drouet, who was, French. And she was tested by members of the French Academy to see if she was, for real or not. And she was for real.
And she was for real.
Yeah. And Ginczanka was certainly absolutely for real. Yeah.
Well, that sort of leads me into a couple of other issues. She was trilingual as she grew up. She spoke Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish. And she never quite embraced her Jewish identity, which is another interesting issue. But as she grew up, she was determined to adhere to Polish as her language to write in. She wrote about many issues and many concerns, but she was absolutely intent on Polish as her language. Why was that, and how did that combine with her early development within the general sort of environment of her childhood and the places where she lived?
As far as I can tell, it was a matter of sheer affinity. She loved the Polish language. She never disavowed her Jewish identity, by the way. No. She just didn't make a point of it really, but she didn't disavow it. She wrote some poems on Jewish subjects, even about Jewish subjects in the town in which she grew up. I mean, so relatively early on, she wrote, a poem about a poor Jew who is sort of, singing for his supper.
Yes, you've quoted some of that in your essay.
Right. But she loved the Polish language. I mean, she had a choice of Ukrainian language schools, Russian language schools, and Jewish, Yiddish, and maybe and Polish. And she chose Polish. I mean, I think that she would have had the same answer to the question of whether she was Polish or Jewish as a poet whom she probably met later on, and whom I like to quote on the subject. And this was Alexander Watt.
Oh, yes.
Wonderful
poet.
A wonderful poet, modernist poet, a modernist poet. And when in Poland and in interwar Poland, and when he was asked, are you Polish or Jewish? He would say, I am Polish, and Jewish. And I think that Zuzanna probably, felt the same way.
Well, apart from her Jewish consciousness, her political consciousness came to the fore fairly early, I believe. What can you say? What can you tell us about her realization or the growth of her understanding about the situation in Poland, the growth of anti-Semitism and the whole atmosphere there? Because I believe she became very conscious pretty early of what was happening in her world. Some of her poetry was satirical, attacking anti-Semitism. When did this begin to affect her life in a serious way?
Well, I think that didn't happen till later. I mean, that didn't happen till she went to Warsaw. These issues weren't sort of quite so urgent when she was in Równe, when she was growing up in Równe. And she went to Warsaw when she was 17. Was she 17? No, she was a bit older. But when she went to Warsaw, she became much more aware of it. First of all, it's interesting that when she went to Warsaw, she said it was the first time that she saw Orthodox Jews.
Interesting.
She didn't see them in Równe. The Równe population was, really divided into half and half, half Jewish and half Polish. And, the Jews were industrialists and, did many trades. I mean, it was not, this was not a very anti-Semitic town as far as one can tell. But in Warsaw, she became very aware of this Jewish presence. She was, rather amazed by it. But as for anti-Semitism, she became much more aware of it as the 1930s went on. And as anti-Semitism became much more acceptable partly because of the change of government to a much more nationalist party, which did not approve of, multiculturalism and ethnic diversity.
Sure. Yeah.
And before that, Poland was in fact very multicultural before the West was, one should say. So that's when she became aware of those issues. But her main preoccupation in her young years was really writing poetry.
Writing poetry, yes. Well, we're going to have a sample of that a little bit later on. But speaking of poetry in general, you've highlighted in your essay how extraordinary her imagination was and her skill, her originality, the intensity and beauty of her language. At the same time, her own beauty sometimes got her into trouble. She was very much pursued by men, I believe, and probably quite early on, she had some relationships of various kinds that we might not even know about, but some have been documented. She did get married eventually, but I believe her relationship with her husband was a kind of a marriage of convenience. Or was she having relationships outside of that?
Well, she had many relationships, but I don't think that any of them were, came to completion really, or were fulfilled or became full relationships. I think she probably had an element of shyness in her. And also, I think men were quite shy around her. She was, impressive. She was absolutely beautiful. She was very tall. She was taller than most of the men who sort of, courted her, or at least were interested in her. So she did not have complete relationships or completely fulfilling relationships. And her biographer says it's quite possible that she died a virgin. It's not impossible. She was courted or flirted with by many men. She was seen as a muse, but they were often intimidated by her, or it just didn't work out. And she got married very late. That is late in her short trajectory. And after many of the Jewish poets in Poland went into the Soviet Union because they thought that they would be safer there. And it was there that she met a man who was communist and therefore, had kind of legitimacy in that regime and could protect her. And she married him.
That was Michał Weinzierher, her husband.
Yeah.
But at the same time, she had a truer love throughout those years, didn't she? Janusz Woźniakowski. What were the dynamics there between, in the triangle?
Oh, I think, the relationship was accepted by all and known by all. I mean, Weinshaller, I think, married her in order to protect her. He was he was a communist, and he had professional credentials and professional certificates which protected him. But I mean, perhaps, we should talk a little bit about her Warsaw period, because that's what preceded all of this. And at some point she went to Warsaw and joined this group of poets, which was led by Julian Tuwim, who was, the most famous poet, Polish or Jewish of that period. And it's actually very interesting that, that five of the most famous Polish poets at that time were Jewish, but Tuwim was, the sort of the most famous of them all. And the Warsaw period was really interesting and really quite lively and happy, and sort of, quite telling about Polish Jewish culture of that period, because, she belonged to a group. There were these groups, there were poetic groups. And, there was a definite pecking order among these groups. And the group led by Julian Tuwim, called Skamander, was, the very top, the top of the Colosseum. It was the top. And so she was admitted to it, easily and immediately, because he was already aware of her. She submitted some of her poems to a magazine, a newspaper, of which he was the editor-in-chief. So he was aware of her, and he became a kind of patron. So she belonged to the Skamander group. And the Skamander group included, many writers and poets who became internationally known, or, later, or at least, very well known in Poland. I mean, Tuwim was hugely famous and well known. And I was still reading and memorizing his poems when I was growing up in Krakow after.
I also had them read to me in Poland.
Yeah. So yes, and Tuwim's story, actually, I mean, just parenthetically, is interesting, because he was extremely aware of the growing Polish anti-Semitism. But he was, a complete Polish patriot. But he left. He somehow managed to go into the United States into exile during the war. But then he came back to Poland, because he really was patriotic.
Yes.
So anyway, he was, he felt very Polish. So he ran this, this commander group, and she was admitted into it immediately. And, as far as I can tell, they had a lot of fun. Yeah.
Were other women poets and writers members of Skamander, or did she have a special sort of standing there?
She had very much a special standing. There was at least one woman that I'm aware of, who also wrote poems for them. But that's the only one I am aware of. So she did have a special standing. And Tuwim, really, liked her a lot, and they had a very sort of playful, good relationship. Absolutely, not romantic or sexual in any way, very playful. So when he called her, he would say on the phone, Zuzanna, this is one of the elders calling. And she had these very interesting eyes. One was green and one was blue. and he would call her light beer and dark beer. Anyway,
it's disconcerting looking at her.
Yeah. So her Warsaw period was very fruitful and I think very enjoyable.
Well, speaking about poetry and poets, we thought we would listen to one of Zuzanna's poems, and we chose a poem that is called May 1939. Perhaps, Eva, you'd like to say something about the poem and the context in which it was written, obviously on the eve of war, just a few months before the outbreak in September.
Yes, well, I mean, in the mid-30s, excuse me, in the mid-30s, the atmosphere in Poland became much more reactionary, really, and much more anti-Semitic when a new government was elected, which was led by a hyper-nationalist prime minister or leader. And the previous leader, Piłsudski, approved of, multiculturalism and liked the idea. Dmowski didn't.
It all changed, yes.
So the atmosphere really changed. And Zuzanna was very aware of it. In 1935, she enrolled in the university, in the Warsaw University, but she was aware enough of what was going on so that when she went to attend her classes, she was escorted. She felt she needed an escort. Was very tall and not, man who was not going to be attacked with impunity. So she was very aware of it. She did not write expressly political poems before. She was very class conscious, as I think we said. She was very conscious about class differences among women and as well as everybody else. But she was not expressly political. She did not belong to any of the many political youth groups which actually thrived during that period. She, was devoted to poetry. I mean, poetry was her politics was poetry. But the atmosphere changed, and she wrote poems. Sometimes she wrote satirical poems, interestingly, about what was going on. Because she also did write satirical poems as part of the Scamander group. They had a supplement called Szpilki, or pins, and she wrote some very funny and very good, but sometimes quite telling poems. But then she, everybody, and she became very aware that war may come. That the Nazis were becoming much more aggressive, and the possibility of Nazi invasion was clearly growing.
That's the context in which the poem arose.
Yes.
Well, Eva, would you like to read the poem in Polish? To give us a sense of the music, the rhythm, and the flow of her writing. It's not necessarily a typical poem because she wrote in many different styles and forms, but this one is a relatively formal poem. It rhymes and it has a regular stanza structure of quatrains, 4-line stanzas. So if you read it in Polish, and then I will read a translation.
I will do my best. I haven't read poems in Polish in a long time. Maj 1939. Raz wzbiera we mnie nadzieja, raz jestem niespokojna. Zbyt wiele rzeczy się dzieje, coś przyjdzie, miłość lub wojna. Są znaki, że przyjdzie wojna, kometa, orędzia, mowy. Są znaki, że przyjdzie miłość, serce, zawroty głowy. Kometa błysnęła nocna, gazeta nadbiegła dzienna. Wiosno, o wiosno miłosna, nie, nie miłosna, wojenna. Pełnia nadeszła wiosenna i snów ze sobą zaniosła. O wiosno, wiosno wojenna, nie, nie wojenna, miłosna. Czytam codzienne dodatki, wnioski z dodatków snuję. Obrywam na kwiatach płatki, kocha, lubi, szanuje. Brzemienna, wróżebna wiosno, inna od innych wiosen. Cokolwiek byś mi przyniosła, wszystko przyjmę i zniosę. Na maju rozstaju stoję, u dróg rozdrożnych i sprzecznych, gdy obie te drogi dwoje wiodą do spraw ostatecznych. Tęsknota nadciąga chmurą, wieści przez radio płyną. Czy pójdę górą, czy pójdę doliną.
Thank you. Well, the uncertainty and the sense of being poised on a kind of a fulcrum certainly comes across there, and a sort of sadness as well. Well, this translation is basically by Marek Kazimierski, but with some input from me. May 1939. At times, hope in me rises. At others, I fear what's in store. Life is too full of surprises. What's coming? Is it love or war? Some signs proclaim that it's war, comets, speeches, reports. Others claim it is love, the heart and feverish thoughts. A comet flashes above and all the headlines roar. This spring will spring forth love. Not love, it will bring war. Spring with its dreams in store, drawn by the moon above. Spring, oh, it threatens war. Not war, it heralds love. I while away troubled hours, reading the news on the trot, plucking the petals from flowers. He loves me not. Portentous, pregnant spring, so different from others I've known. Whatever the future brings, I will bear it as my own. Come summer, I will finally see which way my future extends. Both love and war, for me, lead to absolute ends. Longing calls from above. The radio delivers dread. When I go, will I go up or down the low road instead?
Yes, yeah.
Well, let's have a quick look at which road she did take and which road fate conducted her along. First of all, there were a couple of betrayals. Tell us something about her period after Warsaw and when she went to Lvov and what happened to her subsequently leading up to her tragic death in 1945, and what happened to her poetry afterwards as well.
Well, she left for Lvov together with many other, Jewish poets and writers, because the Nazis invaded Poland, and they thought they would be safer in the Soviet Union. There was a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and the Soviet Union was supposed to be a safe place. So she went with quite a few others, and the price of being sheltered there, which they were. I mean, they were given housing, they were given work. She was translating. She knew 3 languages, and so she worked as a translator. But basically, they had to pledge allegiance to Stalin.
Yes.
It wasn't, all that palatable, but that's what they had to do. So they lived in Lviv, and several of them lived in a particular building. Then, in 1940, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact broke down, and the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. And this was in Lviv, followed immediately by a terrible pogrom. During this pogrom, the Jewish, the Polish Jews who were there tried to hide, and so did she. And she was in hiding with a few other people whom she knew from Równe, in a particular building. And it turned out that, they were given these, places to live in, but, within these places to live, they hid, they made hiding places. But it turned out that the landlady of the building in which they were sheltering, hiding, was viciously anti-Semitic. And she informed on people when the Nazis did sort of revisions, of buildings. They were trying to chase, to look for Jews, and she pointed out Jewish people to them. Now, on one occasion when this happened, Ginczanka escaped. She managed to somehow escape via the back door. But, things were clearly becoming extremely dangerous. And the Weinshaller, who, married her in order to protect her, decided that they had to go to Krakow. And they did. They managed to make it to Krakow. And in Krakow, she was again hidden by some Polish people who were, doing it. At least some of them were doing it absolutely out of principle. They were involved in helping Jewish people and, Jewish children in some cases. So she was sheltered, but she was in a very reduced state and very frightened at that point and didn't want to go out on the street. And of course, she was quite right. She was very recognizably Jewish. So she was just sort of in hiding and, became very, very sort of uncertain of, very, very insecure, very, very unlike herself.
And she was betrayed again, wasn't she?
And she was betrayed. Whether it was accidental or not is very unclear. It's quite possible. It's very unclear what happened, but somehow information about her was delivered to these Nazi overseers of a prison. It may have been a complete slip on the part of the men with whom she was in love and who may have left some piece of paper. I don't know. The biography is unclear at this point. But in any case, so she was arrested in this prison alongside her great childhood friend, and they remained friends all through these various vicissitudes.
That's Blumka Fradis, yes.
Yeah. So they were arrested. And she was basically tortured. And one of the ways in which she was tortured was that, you know, the Nazi overseers of the prison dragged her by her hair, and she had beautiful long black hair, and she particularly wanted to protect her hair, and it was some act of, you know, really sort of devilish intuition that they knew that she wanted to protect her hair, and so, you know, basically she was tortured, and she would not admit that she was Jewish. But Blumka caved in and said they were.
So that sealed their fate together.
So that sealed their fate together, yeah.
After, and then she was taken to a place where she was eventually murdered.
Yes, then they were both taken to this other prison, which was a prison where people were executed. And they were both executed, yeah.
So after she died, her writings, what happened? Some of them or all of them were saved by a friend of hers who found them in her Warsaw flat, not long after she'd left, in fact.
Yes. A friend went into her flat after she left. And found all of her, you know, manuscripts, all of her poems, and preserved them. So this was, you know, really quite a miraculous act, you know, because otherwise it would have been entirely...
Would have lost it. Yeah. Do you think the bulk of the poetry has survived from that mature period? Did she have them all in a series of notebooks or...
You know, there were manuscripts. I mean, I don't know exactly in what form, but they were manuscripts. I think probably they did. It's a large body of poetry, you know. It's, you know, 225 pages or so of poetry. So I think they probably did survive, yeah.
And there is an edition now, a sort of a collected poems that has come out in Poland.
Yes.
Yes. A memorable face on the front. Yeah.
Face with her puppy. Yes.
And what was the fate of her work under Soviet communism up until the collapse of the empire in 1991?
I think she was, you know, neglected. I mean, I don't think she was censored, but I don't think she was, you know, known about really.
She sort of lapsed into some sort of obscurity in that period. Did she?
Yeah. And so it was not really until, you know, 2017 and that exhibition, you know, that her work started being excavated and, you know, commented on and you know, became prominent again.
And it was championed by people like Szymborska and Miłosz, was it? And Zbigniew Herbert. Did they appreciate and promote her work after, you know, in that latter period?
I wish I knew the answer to that, but I don't. Is that what you have read about?
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that Szymborska, certainly, and Miłosz were very much aware of her and you know, were kind of championing her to some extent, but I don't know to what extent.
Yeah, I think Miłosz was aware of her even when she was in Warsaw. I think, you know.
Right. Yeah.
So, yes. Yeah. I mean, I would not be surprised at all. Yeah.
Well,
now, mind you, you know, Miłosz, you know, in that period was not in Poland. I mean, you know,
he was in the US, wasn't he?
Yeah. So yes. So I doubt that he would have been championing it in Poland. I mean, he didn't return to Poland until he started returning occasionally in the 1990s. Yeah. So you know, not right after the war.
No, but after the fall of communism in Poland. Yes. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. I wanted to, I had many other things that we could have talked about, but I wanted to say something about, or ask you something about what you've been working on since you wrote the essay, and what some of your future projects might be.
Gosh.
For example, you mentioned a play about Równe that you were interested in producing at some stage, or having produced.
Listen, I wrote that play a long time ago, and it has had, I wrote it in 2001. I mean, it was, and it came out of a real experience. It came out of an anniversary celebration, really, of a terrible massacre which took place during the war.
Yes.
In Równe. So, but I wrote it a very long time ago. It has had some staged readings, but it has never had a full production. And partly there was a very unfortunate reason for that, which was that the director who did the last staged reading, which was actually wonderful, but he did it with 16 actors, which would very expensive production. And we were talking about, doing it with 8 actors, and we were thinking about that and planning to do something about that. And then he was on vacation in France and had a heart attack and died in his swimming. So the play has never come to fruition. I keep thinking that it actually should. It really is about the problems of Polish-Jewish relations, except with it's broader than that. I mean, it's really about the unfolding of communal violence and how it unfolds and what leads to it and how it can be stopped.
And one of your novels was very much about music and pianism. You yourself nearly became a concert pianist. And I was wondering about the influence of music. Well, obviously, I know about the influence of music in your life, but I was just coming back for a moment to Ginczanka. Is there any information about whether about her involvement with music in any way, or in her interest or in her practice of it? Because she had all the opportunities as a child to learn and to study, didn't she? All the arts.
She had piano lessons, but so did many others. I mean, this was kind of she had a proper sort of a proper upbringing of a proper young English, young Polish lady. She had French lessons and piano lessons, but no, I mean, with her musical impulses exhibited themselves in her poetry, I don't think she played any instruments. She loved dancing. She did have enormous joie de vivre, and so she went dancing. But no, she did not play. As I say, it's the music of the language that she was working in, and her poems
eventuate the way it may have. Did you ever have regrets about not continuing with music?
Initially, I had deep regrets. I mean, I think it was the right decision for me, but it was a very difficult decision to make. And one of the reasons, for my decision was that I understood that I probably could not be Arthur Rubinstein. I could not be Paulini. And, not being Arthur Rubinstein or Paulini and being a pianist was, not an enviable fate. And in writing, I thought, at least I can do something of my own. I mean, piano music has been recorded peerlessly and played peerlessly many times over. There was nothing that I could really add. And in writing, I thought I could add something. I could do something of my own.
And you've written very in a very passionate, interesting way about your involvement with language when you left Poland and became determined to master English and to inhabit your new language, as you've put it. And I was wondering, do you, when you write, do you sometimes still think in Polish after all these years, or is it all English now?
It is all English. I have transposed myself into English, and it was really, I was young enough to do that. I was not quite 14 when we emigrated to Canada, and I was quite determined to make English my first language because there was nobody around with whom I could speak Polish, and language was very important to me. And when I started, hearing the music of English, which I couldn't hear for a long time, I was very happy, that finally English became musical to me. So I was very happy. And when I could hear the music of language in a poem for the first time, I was very happy. When I had my first dream in English, I was very happy.
Your first dream in English, did you say?
Yes. And moreover, the dream was in rhyme.
Wow.
And I remember it because, it was such an important moment. And the dream said, "The cottage is the heart of desire. It is the sun itself which lights the fire." I was very pleased when I woke up. I mean, that English spoke to me like that.
And did you begin to contemplate a poetic direction in your writing at that point, or?
No, I didn't. No, I suppose that would not have been out of the question, but it was not what I wanted to do somehow. So I'm, very envious of you, really. I mean, I know that music is important in your life, but you have poetry within which to express that.
Well, they are two sides of the same coin in a way, aren't they? You can't have poetry without music. Or in a sense, you can't have music without poetry in a very philosophical sense, I guess I mean. They are very much intertwined.
Yes, they are. And so, so when I could hear, the music of English poetry, I was very happy. And I think, the music of Polish poetry continues to be alive for me insofar as I read Polish poetry and involved. For a while, I was very involved with Polish poetry because I was reviewing Polish poets in the New York Times. So, so I caught up quite a bit on Polish poetry then. And, I've just finished recently this book on Czesław Miłosz. A short book on Czesław Miłosz. So I was, reading his poetry a lot, of course. Yeah. So the music of poetry is important to me. Yeah.
Well, this would be an interesting note, perhaps, to end on. Just perhaps with a quote from your essay about Ginczanka. You said, "In her poetry, she is a living presence. She speaks to us with an immediacy and eloquence that increases our sense of what was lost and makes us grateful for what remains." And we are indeed grateful for what remains of her poetry. We're also very grateful, Eva, to you for having joined us today for this conversation and for speaking with me. And thank you very, very much. I've really enjoyed listening to you and chatting about Ginczanka.
Thank you very much. The pleasure has been mutual. Thank you very much indeed.
And I'll hand us both over now to Nick, and I will say farewell for now.
Farewell.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eva and Alex, for such a deep insight into Zuzanna, a person most of us have been unaware of until now, and the passion that you both have for Poland and poetry and for literature shone through that entire interview. Thank you so much. It was contagious. And thank you also, of course, to Jewish Quarterly for commissioning Eva's essay. And it's another example of why you should be subscribing to Jewish Quarterly. Amazing publication. Just before you all go, I'd just like to invite you to join us for our first in-person event in more than 2 years. On Tuesday, 15th of March, we'll be presenting The Other Side of the Story, The Other Side of the Story, Rachel Conn in conversation with Rabbi Fred Morgan. It's at the Glen Ira Council Auditorium. Tickets are available through our website and seats are limited, so please book early. And a very quick save the date message, very exciting. From the 28th to the 31st of May, we will be presenting at last our in-person festival, the first one since 2018 for reasons we're all very aware of, with an extraordinary lineup of events and panels, writers, performers. We'll be releasing details in the very near future, so subscribe to our newsletter via our website if you don't already do so. It's going to be a huge year. In the meantime, thank you again, Eva and Alex, and good evening, everybody, and take care.
And thank you, Nick. All the very best.
Thank you very much indeed for having me here.